Hello everybody, welcome back to my channel. I am Stephanie Bree. This is Horror Trans. I am a transgender woman and I talk about all things horror. And this is horror icon Jason Voorhees. And I gotta get a drink of my Gatorade real quick. Alright. So last week, or earlier in the week, I did Michael Myers. Between the two, Jason is infinitely more interesting than Michael Myers. So I'm going to put that out there. By and large, movie for movie, there are more watchable, enjoyable Friday the 13th than there are watchable, enjoyable Halloweens, even though there are by far more Halloweens in total than there are Jason movies. And Friday the 13th, and I have to specify because the original Friday the 13th does not have Jason in it to speak of. I mean, he makes a cameo and a reference, but he's not really in it. So let's clarify before the nerds at me to correct me. So, Jason Voorhees. Here's the story. Jason Voorhees is mentally handicapped and physically deformed. He's developmentally challenged. Now, we would have used an outdated word when this movie was made, but since my girlfriend is autistic, and most of my friends are as well, I'm not going to use that word, because it's outdated. So I will say I'll say he's developmentally challenged. I can't really diagnose and say he's on the spectrum or not, but he's not got his faculties about him. And he's physically deformed. Because of this, the kids at the camp the summer camp where his mother works, where he attends, presumably for free because she's an employee, or a discount, perhaps. He gets bullied, and while the camp counselors are supposed to be watching him, they're off boning instead. So he drowns and dies. Presumably. We say presumably dies. He drowns for sure, at least we can say with confidence. Remember, drowning doesn't mean death. But we're getting into the weeds. Sometime later, some hippies try to reopen Camp Crystal Lake. And Pamela Voorhees, Jason's mother, goes on a murder spree and kills as many of the camp counselors as she can before one of them lobs her head off. Now, deformed, developmentally challenged, antisocial Jason Voorhees, living in the woods, raised essentially as a wild animal, grows up, finds his mother's decapitated body, and decides to get revenge, or decapitated head. Decides to get revenge on the teenagers who invade his territory, and goes on a murder spree. Unlike Michael Myers, where you have multiple fucking timelines and you have different iterations of Michael Myers, there's one or two Jasons, and I say one or two, because you could argue, and there's a strong case that can be made, that the Friday the 13th Platinum Dunes remake Jason is essentially the same as the New Line Cinema Paramount Pictures Jason. You could make that argument, and I would buy it. I'm not going to make that argument, so for the sake of simplicity, I'm going to say there's two Jasons, maybe three, but we'll get into the maybe in a second. So, in Friday the 13th Part 2, Jason goes back to the lake and finds a bunch of camp counselors, not at Crystal Lake, but at a different camp on the same lake as Camp Crystal Lake. So you have, the lake is called Crystal Lake, but you have other campsites along the lake, which is par for the course. I used to work at a summer camp. I was a camp counselor when I was a teenager, so that's par for the course. One of the final girl in Friday the 13th 2, Jenny, uses her child psychology education to trick Jason into thinking she's his mother, which almost works, but then it doesn't at the end. In that moment, we see that Jason is under the belief in his own mind that his mother is still alive and giving him orders, which is to kill teenagers, essentially. Jason's a big man. He's over 6.5, 7 foot tall. He's huge. He's buff. He's muscular. He's massive. He's got a lot of meat and muscle on his bones. So he's hard to kill in the beginning because he can take a lot of punishment. He doesn't have, he doesn't really register pain like normal because he's been living in the wild. So he's used to pain. So like he has a high tolerance for pain. So like stabbing him isn't going to stop him. Shooting him isn't likely to stop him unless, of course, you shoot him in the head, which they never do. They never do in any of these movies. But anyways. And then in Friday the 13th 3, he gets his hockey mask, which is his iconic image that we're familiar with. And he gets an axe to the head, which is what gives us the iconic gash in the hockey mask that we're familiar with. But he essentially takes a beating and survives. Friday the 13th Part 2, or 3, excuse me. And we move on to Friday the 13th Part 4, the final chapter. Now, he does not survive this movie. He dies. A definitive end. Even though it's called the final chapter, and it is a definitive end, the franchise doesn't stop here. So, we have a Jason not Jason for Friday the 13th Part 5. Basically, what that means is we have a copycat. Somebody else who's dressing like Jason and killing using Jason's MO, but who isn't Jason at all. And then in Friday the 13th Part 6, we get Zombie Jason, who we will have for most of the rest of the franchise, with a couple of sidebars. Detours, I'll say. So then we have the new beginning, the New Blood, excuse me, where he fights a psychic girl who's essentially a Carrie imitation knockoff. Kmart Carrie, as fans call her. And then we have Jason Takes Manhattan. This is the end of the first timeline. This is the end of the Paramount Pictures Friday the 13th franchise. Between Jason Takes Manhattan and Freddy vs. Jason in 2003, New Line Cinema picks up the rights to the Jason character and mythology. They do not get the rights to Friday the 13th, so they cannot call their movies Friday the 13th, blah, blah, blah. They have to call them Jason, blah, blah, blah. And the first one they do is Jason Goes to Hell, the final Friday. I've already talked about this movie. This is rubbish. In this movie, Jason is not a boy who grew up and killed people and came back as a zombie. In this movie, Jason is an evil entity that gets passed from Vorhees to Vorhees somehow. Which I guess if you want to retcon Friday the 13th 1 and 2, you would say Pamela somehow passed it onto Jason, baby Jason. And that's how he was brought back to life, I guess. If you want to retcon it and go that route, I suppose you could. I'd rather not do that. I'd rather pretend like this movie never happened. And not touch the others. And then the next movie in the franchise is Jason X, where scientists freeze his body in a cryo freeze and wake him up way the fuck far in the future on a spaceship, and he kills everybody on the spaceship. what we get out of this movie is Uber Jason, which is a hybrid Jason zombie cyborg thing. You could argue that's a separate Jason. So if we're going to go different timelines, different Jasons, you have the Paramount Jason, you have the Jason Goes to Hell Jason, you have the Jason X Jason, and then you have the Freddy versus Jason, and then the remake Jason. That's 5 Jasons by my count. Ignoring Jason Goes to Hell, but adopting Jason X and Freddy vs. Jason into the Paramount timeline, which I'm okay doing, then you end up with 3 Jasons. 3 different Jasons. Which is a little more manageable. So I'm going to start with, and I'm going to kind of bounce around, but I'm going to start with the Jason Goes to Hell Jason. This one is an evil entity that possesses people's dead bodies. And if it enters the body of a Vorhees, then it resurrects Jason. Like, hockey mask and everything. So this one's way the fuck out there. Out in left field fantasy horror. Really weird as fuck. This Jason is motivated by the fact that it is literally pure evil. This Jason's kills are gruesome because this evil entity has no reason to kill other than it's what it exists to do. That's its purpose in the universe, is to kill. So it kills everybody indiscriminately. It just kills. Jason, the Paramount Jason, and then we'll talk about the remake last. The Paramount Jason is a wild animal, a force of nature. I've heard it said, and this is true, I've seen all 8 of the Paramount Jasons. Every time Jason appears, there's a thunderstorm. I've heard it said that Jason is an embodiment of Mother Nature, sent to punish those who invade Crystal Lake. I don't accept that, because then it's like, why doesn't Jason go kill people in San Francisco who are polluting the air? I don't know. Whatever. I don't buy that one. So I'm going to throw that aside. But I wanted to mention it because it is a popular theory. So, he is, that being said, a force of nature. He's a wild animal. He is not a human being, necessarily. I mean, technically, he is a human being, but he died and then came back to life somehow. Dies again and comes back as a zombie. So, he was at one point human, but along the way, he loses his humanity. So, at what point does he stop being human and start being just a monster? Is up for debate. It just depends on how you explain little boy Jason drowning and then him being a full-grown man in the next movie, which presumably is the very next day in the timeline. So I don't know how you explain that. Or maybe it's not the next day. Maybe it's a year later or something like that. It's not very much time has passed based on the evidence that the final girl from part 1 is still the same age as she was in part 2 as she was in part 1. So she can't be too much older. It can't be 10 years later. They would have aged her in that case, which they didn't. So we can assume she hasn't aged. So, let's assume Jason is human up until the end of part 4. And then he comes back as a zombie in part 6. We're going to skip over part 5 because that's not Jason. We're talking about Jason, the character, not the copycat, and we're not talking about his mother. Those are videos down the road. Most likely what happened is the bullies chase Jason into the lake, and they watch him drown, freak out, and run back and tell the adults, oh my god, he drowned. And Jason swims to shore on the other side of the lake, or washes up unconscious on the other side of the lake. Either or. And they don't find his body, but they just pronounce him dead. And they move on because Crystal Lake's a big lake, and they don't have the resources. It's a small town. They don't have the resources to comb the lake, and they're not going to call in the FBI or whatever because whatever. It's an open and shut case. He's dead. Move on. And then he grows up in the woods. Now, let's talk about Jason's humanity because I want to get to part 3, and you know where I'm going with this. If you've seen part 3, you know where I'm going with this. Jason is a boy. By the looks of him and by most accounts, I would say between the ages of 10 and 13. So he's a preteen at best when he dies or when he drowns. So he goes through puberty in the wild with no outlet, no sexual outlet. So we have to put a pin in that. We know Jason takes pleasure in killing. I'm not a psychologist, so I can't guess as to why that is, but there's plenty of evidence that he takes pleasure in killing because 1, he gets creative with his kills. He tries new things with every kill. He never does the same kill twice. And also the way he displays the bodies after he's killed them, it's sort of artistic. It's art. He's proud of himself. He's like, look what I did. He's showing off, which means he's having fun doing it. It also tells us he has human emotions. He has the emotion of pride. He has the emotion of joy. He presumably does not have the emotion of fear, but he may have anger, revenge, regret, those emotions. But he doesn't have fear. Probably because he's lived this long in the woods, nothing can touch him. So he's like, yeah, I'm unstoppable. Fuck it, Go me, So he doesn't have fear. Why would he, So, I don't know where geographically Crystal Lake is supposed to take place. But I do know it's somewhere on the East Coast. So we can assume that there are probably bears and wolves and wild dogs and other animals that he has to compete with for food and kill. So let's just, for the sake of simplicity, say he's fought a wolf and survived. This is why he has no fear. That, of course, is speculation, but let's move on. Now, in Friday the 13th, Part 3, there's a flashback scene where Jason attacks a girl, a teenage girl, wrestles her to the ground, and then she passes out. Wakes up in her bed, no memory of what happens next. If you know anything about trauma or PTSD, you can assume he raped her. And the reason why I say that is because her brain blotted out the memory. So something traumatic happened to him. She didn't just pass out from fear and then he's like, oh shit, I guess she's dead, and walked away. He wouldn't do that. We've seen this before. Others have tried faking death in his presence and he just kills them anyways. Because he's like, fuck it, I'm not falling for that. And also, he kills indiscriminately. He kills every living creature he comes across. Well, human, no. I'd say every living creature he comes across, because he does kill the dog in Part 4. And he may or may not have killed the dog in Part 2. So that's 2 dogs he killed. And we can't say for sure if he killed wild animals. But we can say with a degree of certainty that he must have killed wild animals growing up, because what was he eating all those years? What was he eating? He had to be eating wild animals. He probably didn't have a can opener in his little log cabin, and he wasn't, breaking into people's homes and stealing, cans of green beans. We can safely assume. Otherwise, that would have been mentioned somewhere in the news reports or something. It would have been like, oh yeah, whatever. So we can make that assumption. So he does kill animals. I think it's fair to say he does. But he does have human emotions. He has curiosity. He's driven by curiosity. So it's perfectly conceivable, in a moment of weakness, he sees a girl lying there on the floor, and instead of killing her, he says, you know what? I'm going to try something new for a change, just to see what happens. Presumably decides he doesn't like it, maybe. Maybe he's homosexual, maybe he's asexual, we don't know. But he decides in that moment he didn't get pleasure out of it. Or he decides, you know what, killing's more fun. Killing's more fun. Zombie Jason, on the other hand, is driven by just a force of nature. He's driven to kill for the sake of killing. He no longer shows any emotions as Zombie Jason. He just literally kills to kill. So Zombie Jason, while not technically a different character, the character has evolved. He's died and come back to life. So now, any traces of fear he may have had previously are gone. And instead what we see is a fiercer, more violent, more graphic, more determined killer than what we saw before. This Jason doesn't fuck around. So, there is that. And then you have the remake Jason. I have not seen the remake all the way through, which is why I haven't reviewed it on the channel yet, because I got bored with it and I couldn't finish it. So, all I can say about the remake Jason is he's more or less a hodgepodge of the Paramount Jason and the New Line Jason. He's like a mixture of both. More or less. But he does have more, from what I have seen. He has anger, which is a new emotion that he exhibits. He doesn't really show anger or frustration in the movies prior to the remake. So that's as much as I can say about Jason Voorhees. Really, anything else I say, I'm going to be repeating myself or digging into the weeds into areas I'm not qualified to dig into. So, Jason Voorhees, horror icon.